I'm a local girl and grew up in Chichester, went to school in Chichester, and there was always the stigma of Graylingwell, the asylum up on the hill, and it was quite a scary thought.
It was often known as the bin, the loony bin, and it's the stigma that went with it, and I think still does with mental health. It's very much still around today.
The hospital was built for 450 patients. When it opened in 1897, it was very soon full. It was in the mid-20th century, though, that Graylingwell reached its highest numbers, which were well over 1,000 patients. The recording of how the mentally ill were dealt with could be looked upon as barbaric. There were various medical restraints, there were various mechanical restraints. Of course, there were the infamous padded cells. Rather brutal treatment of the mentally ill were the blistering of patients for various complaints, as they saw it, as self-harm. And in the 1950s and mid-20th century, of course, we had the increasing use of ECT and drugs which really were not designed to tackle their illness but would make them quiet. Things like belladonna and strychnine. I felt very sad when I read that one poor patient who was given a cocktail of these two drugs mixed with brandy, he died the following morning.
Graylingwell was a good place, and it was a bad place for all sorts of reasons, and so therefore it's very difficult to have one point of view about what it was like. There was a mixture of good and bad, and there were good staff and there were bad staff, and there were easy patients and there were difficult patients.
We certainly had people running off, smashing windows, trying to strangle themselves, cutting their wrists, hitting other people, trying to attack staff, all sorts, really. The list was endless.
And there was a huge range of illnesses, many now that would not be given that sort of treatment. You wouldn't put somebody in an asylum if they had learning difficulties, because that is not an appropriate place for them to be. They need a different type of care. There were people who were there most of their lives, and they didn't have any privacy. Looking at them from now, you would think that they lacked dignity because their dignity wasn't returned to them. You know, it was not a life that you would wanted to have lived, but they had become dependent on that.
Many of them had spent their many years and perhaps weren't even ill anymore. But there were others too that were short-term patients that came in, and it was good to see them get well and go back to their families. And those are the ones that I do remember, that new treatments helped them to go back out into the community rather than become those long-stay patients in the hospital.
I probably was in there for a fortnight, and then I was discharged as an outpatient. I was very lucky. I had good doctors, and when I was an inpatient, the staff were wonderful. They were very kind. You couldn't really pick one out. They were all very, very good and very, very attentive, and it really wasn't like being in hospital at all. I had one or two friends that actually were also in Graylingwell at the same time as me, so we sort of looked after each other, really.
There was a period of time when there was a huge sense of community, so there were occupational therapy activities. Well, there was work for patients, so patients actually worked in the gardens and they worked on the farm and they worked within the hospital itself. So they were kept busy and occupied. They were part of something. They contributed. They worked with other people, and they had this like a family. When I was there, I felt I was part of that whole community. There was a farm. There were gardens, a church, a butchery. Very little came into Graylingwell. You were part of that big community, and so were the patients as well, very much so. It was a very pleasant place to be at that time, until such time that it was decided that instead of going out to work
as the patients did on the farm and in the shop. That was not to happen anymore because it was seen as unpaid labour.
As time passed and things like working within the hospital was considered, well, it became unacceptable, they lost that. They lost that sense of making a contribution, you know, doing something useful, which is what everybody needs anyway.
As it got less and less and the wards got moved out and closed down and they stopped the training from being there, it became a slightly creepy place because it started getting echoey and walking around the old corridors were sort of a bit like being in an underground at night, and it became a bit
It lost
creepy.
its...
It lost its pulse.
There was a significant move towards care in the community, and most of Graylingwell's patients, but not all, most were removed from Graylingwell and housed in the community with specialist support.
A lot of people found themselves, by the very nature of the situation, their history, isolated and on their own with no family. And it was all about them feeling safe. They're very vulnerable people with illnesses that really disabled them in coping with the outside world.
Going from ward to community was an enormous change, wasn't it?
And the fear behind it, yeah.
Things change, time passes, and with new treatments and new understanding of mental health issues, there was a need for change. But the people who were now living in Graylingwell long term, for them, the changes were in a way irrelevant because they needed the security of Graylingwell.
Immediately after I left, I didn't have any support except that I had outpatient's appointment with the psychiatrist, who was Dr. Towers, and I saw him probably once a fortnight for a little while, and then once a month, and gradually tailed off till I was discharged completely.
I think some patients probably need that protection. The asylum and what's not there in the community is that asylum and protection for people, and perhaps care was at Graylingwell for some patients, and perhaps it's not quite there in the community yet until society takes on board mental illness, which I think can affect any of us at any time.